Well, hi everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Feeling Smarter. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, Tim Miller. G'day, Tim. How are you?
Yeah, going well, Aaron. How are you doing?
Not too bad, thank you.
Good.
Well, one topic that has piqued our interest in the last couple of weeks has been a private members bill that has been introduced into the Senate. Now, this is an area that we don't see that often, but quite clearly against the backdrop of Division 296, some might say it's quite a clever bill to be introducing, and that is around what's being referred to as spousal distribution. And the basis of this is to try and tackle the gender gap that exists in balances between, in particular, husband and wife, insofar that the female typically will have a period of time out of work and allow for them to, in essence, top up that balance through a redistribution of wealth between their partner. So, Tim, I might get you to just expand on that a little bit, noting that there are a number of conditions around this bill. We should note it is literally just a bill that's been introduced into the Senate, as I said, a couple of weeks ago, but it makes for quite interesting reading and then conversation going forward.
Yeah, so it's I guess what spikes my interest with it, Aaron, is that as far as a policy goes, what it's clearly addressing, and what it does actually clearly address when you read through some of the material is that there is an existing superannuation equalisation process already, but it happens once spouses have separated, not whilst they're together. And
Yeah.
so, and it does reference that the framework is there to do super splitting from a family law point of view, and so almost then contemplates, well, why shouldn't that opportunity be available for people that remain in a relationship and be able to equalise their balances, albeit with an equalisation that incorporates retaining preservation, retaining the tax-free and taxable components, and those other elements. But where it's interesting and where it's quite similar to an existing spousal opportunity, which is contribution splitting, is it's effectively applicable to pre-condition of release members. So it's only available if you are under 60, or if you're between 60 and 65 and haven't made a declaration of retirement there. So it is restricted in who can apply this measure, and we might touch on what happens for those people older than that anyhow a little bit later. But also, it's only applicable if you've got one superannuation fund. So they're looking at keeping the mechanics of it quite clean to say that if you've got more than one superannuation fund, that you're not eligible to be able to utilise this. And whether that's all about balance tracking and other things, again, it's all about simplicity there. But yeah, and not applicable for retirement phase interest. So if you're in a pension, you can't split your money to your accumulation-based spouse, and you can't do it if you're in defined benefit schemes.
Yeah, so the interesting one is obviously multiple accounts, because this is quite a common feature of SMSF membership today, and in particular where we have individuals that are in pre-retirement. So why is that the case? Well, I think ATO statistics support about 31% of members of an SMSF have an external super fund, predominantly an APRA regulated fund, that they would have an account with as well. In a lot of instances, that's pretty much to cover insurance, group cover and the like. So that in itself creates a bit of a challenge there. And I think, Tim, the other thing that you raised is the fact that um, this can be done once a year, uh, or there are other ways in which this might be looked at. So I'm interested in your comments about, if this sort of came to pass ultimately, would this be a strategy that might get looked at annually, or do you think it's going to be something that maybe people will explore more as a kind of pre-retirement strategy as they look to equalize up the balances between members?
Yeah, look, I think that's an interesting point, and one of the key considerations in that point is the limit on this measure, and that is that it is actually driven by the transfer balance cap, the general transfer balance cap, And as such, what you can't do is two things. You can't split to your spouse if your spouse has more money than you. So it really is an equalization thing. So, if you've got one spouse with $1 million, to keep it simple, and another spouse with 500,000, then you can split 250, right? And both end up with 750. So, that might be a liquidity thing, particularly if we're not talking about the SMSF space. Like, you might not have the liquidity to do 250 in one sort of transaction there. But then to the maximum that you can split is up to the spouse's, up to the general transfer balance cap. So if you've got one spouse with, say, $4 million, right, and you've got another spouse with 500,000 or $1 million, then in theory you can split or you can redistribute up to that $1 million to take them to the $2 million transfer balance cap, and therefore reducing your own balance from 4 down to 3, which of course has a nice nice alignment with the government's measure of Div 296.
Yeah, but and I guess, yes, there are certainly examples that we could utilize that will magically realign balances
Yep.
to do things, right? So again, could it be that we split to an extent that it would allow for us to do a catch-up unused concessional contribution, or the fact that it might get them within a window that allows them to do a 3-year bring forward versus a single year bring forward. These are things that um, can still be achieved within the current landscape. So I understand,
Yep.
mechanics in here might allow for people to take advantage of certain things, but these are things that can occur in a lot of instances anyway inside the superannuation environment.
Yeah, and so when I reflect that I didn't actually answer your question before from whether people would do it annually or like pre-retirement or whatever the case may be. I think that where I was actually leading to was it's in many instances is going to come down to how much money they potentially have, right? And the reality is, if we look at the average size of a self-managed super fund versus the highest balances, so if we're talking average or even median, which is a lower balance there, if we're bringing people equalising pre-retirement, so as a one-off or maybe over 2-year transaction, because you can't do it twice within a calendar year, so you've got to spread it out to at least once a year, which means you're kind of going just over a year each time from a process point of view. But if we're looking at those with median balances, then implementing such things as the recontribution strategy that you talk about there, it might be saying, okay, well, if we want to, from an estate planning point of view, if from a health point of view, from all sorts of other reasons, we go, well, how many recontribution strategies do we actually have in us? We might not have enough to get us from 65 all the way to 75. So is equalising the balances and therefore doing more recontributions, so doing 2 recontribution strategies within the one fund versus one from a member and then the other one in a few years' time, if that kind of makes sense. So,
Yep.
yeah, I think it's one of those things that, because there's no hard and fast rule, because there is no rule, it's certainly strategically something that, on top of contribution splitting, which is quite restrictive in what we can do, and not as potentially used as we would think it should be in that regard. I think it provides sort of better planning opportunities, particularly if you've got liquidity in the fund.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's the $1 million question, Tim. This is, as we said, a private member's bill. So Senator Jane Hume, in opposition, has introduced this measure. It is framed up as the superannuation legislation tackling the gender super gap bill. And for all intent and purposes, we have a more diverse Senate that obviously, the Greens have some level of power in there to approve some stuff if Labor want to pass, as we know with Division 296. This will be fascinating to watch, because when we think more broadly about governments trying to look at spouse equalisation and ensuring that there's enough saved for retirement,
Mhm.
it's politically quite an interesting target. So yes, we might argue here, Senator Jane Hume, I don't want to use the word has form, but quite cleverly she was able to throughout the franking credit debate back in 2019 when Bill Shorten lost the unlosable election. One of the things that she introduced at that time was increasing the number of members from 4 to 6.
Yep.
Now, we didn't see it go through then, but we did subsequently see that change go through. So this may generally have support within the Senate across independent senators and maybe even within the Greens. And then it gets back to the House of Representatives. And again, what would Labor do here for something where ideally around the objective of super and the like, that it would seem on face value that they would try and support. So to me, it will be a fascinating watch to see where this goes. There's the cynic in me that says it might get through, but then Labor might try and sort of squash this. What are your views?
Yeah, well, I think the objective of super, I think, becomes quite an interesting measure when you look at that from an alignment point of view with this legislation or this draft legislation being introduced, this bill being introduced, because the objective talks to words like equalisation, or not equalisation so much, but equality and and fairness in the system.
Yep.
And one thing that I don't know whether you can say fair or not fair in here is that generally, as it is that females take more time off from a child raising point of view than males, so therefore they're out of the superannuation system. And of course, things like paid maternity leave or whatever, and super on top of that are issues that are addressing that. But do they go far enough? In the sense of helping fix that window of inopportunity from a contribution point of view. So I think it becomes a tough bill to argue against. I first read it quite late at night, and I didn't read who it was from to start with. And I thought, wow, this is Labor really hedging their bets here on everything. And then, of course, I read further into it to see that it did come from elsewhere. But yeah, I really do think that it's going to open up quite a fascinating debate, particularly because we now do have an objective of super, which for the last 8 years or whatever we didn't have.
Yeah, and that's really the framework of policy setting going forward. So it should align with the objective of super, and quite cleverly, I think it does. So it will be a fascinating watch as it comes through. And I guess this was something that we recently spoke about in our Changing Face of SMSF, and no doubt, as we follow the tracking of this bill through the Senate and then into the House and then back to the Senate, if it gets that far, we will watch with great interest to see how that transpires. So once again, Tim, thanks for your time again this week.
Always a pleasure.
And we look forward to you joining us for our next edition of Feeling Smarter. Have a great rest of the week. Bye for now.
Bye all.